What if the first rulers remembered by humanity were not human at all? And what if that memory was never meant to survive intact? There is a peculiar quiet at the beginning of history. Not silence, but something more unsettling. The feeling that a story has already been underway for a very long time before anyone thought to write it down. When the earliest civilizations finally began carving their memories into clay and stone, they did not describe origins. They described succession. Kings following kings. Authority passing from one figure to another, as if the most important part had already happened somewhere beyond reach. And, before you allow your body to sink fully into this moment of comfort, take just a very small pause to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in what I'm sharing makes you feel like staying a little longer. If you wish, you can also share where you are and what time it is as you listen. I'm always curious about the small points of light drifting together through the night. The earliest known king lists do not begin with humanity discovering leadership. They begin with leadership already established, already ancient, already unquestioned. In Mesopotamia, the scribes who compiled these lists did not hesitate, did not apologize, did not explain. They simply stated that kingship descended from somewhere else, that it arrived, that it was placed upon the earth, and then they began to count time in numbers so large they still unsettle the modern mind. Thousands of years per reign, tens of thousands. Not a poetic exaggeration, not a metaphor framed as such, but precise figures recorded with administrative calm, names attached, cities assigned, order maintained. It is tempting to dismiss these numbers as symbolic, as mythological shorthand, as the imaginative excess of a culture still learning to distinguish story from fact. But that dismissal comes from a much later habit of thinking, one that assumes ancient people could not distinguish between what they believed and what they recorded. The scribes of early Sumer were not dreamers. They were accountants of grain, surveyors of land, keepers of contracts. Their writing system emerged not to tell stories but to track reality, which makes it harder to ignore the discomforting detail that when these same scribes wrote about kings who ruled for 28,800 years or 36,000 years, they did so with the same hand that recorded barley rations and temple inventories. If this were an isolated case, it would be easy to set aside. But the pattern repeats. In Egypt, the earliest dynastic narratives speak of divine or semi-divine rulers who governed before the first human pharaohs. In India, king lists stretch backward into epochs measured not in centuries but in cosmic ages. In Mesoamerica, rulers traced their legitimacy to beings who came before the present world. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, the story does not begin with humans inventing power, it begins with humans inheriting it. What is most striking is not the presence of gods, but the absence of spectacle. These early rulers are not always described as monsters or miracles. They do not necessarily breathe fire or reshape mountains. Instead, they rule. They judge. They establish order. Their difference is implied rather than displayed. Longevity, authority, a closeness to forces no longer accessible. Modern scholarship often treats these accounts as attempts to glorify kingship by stretching time backward, inflating reigns to lend grandeur to the present. Yet this interpretation quietly assumes that ancient people needed exaggeration to feel legitimacy. It also ignores the careful boundary many texts draw between the era of long-lived rulers and the era that followed. There is a line. It is not blurred. Something ends. Something changes. And after that point, reign lengths collapse into human scale almost immediately. That transition is rarely explained. Sometimes it is attributed to a flood, sometimes to a catastrophe. Sometimes it is simply stated without commentary, as though the reason were too obvious to require elaboration, or too dangerous to preserve. What if the discomfort these records provoke is not accidental? What if they persist because they were never fully erased, only reframed? The idea that non-human kings ruled the earth for thousands of years does not need to be accepted to be taken seriously as a historical problem. It only needs to be acknowledged as a question that refuses to disappear. Because once that door is opened, even slightly, history stops being a straight line. It becomes a surface with layers scraped away, and the deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that humanity may not have stood at the beginning of the story, but somewhere in the middle, waking up to a world already shaped by others. If that were true, the real mystery would not be who those rulers were, but why we were taught to stop asking about them. The problem does not lie in the existence of ancient lists, but in how calmly they present what should be impossible. The Sumerian king list survives in fragments scattered across museums and collections, copied and recopied for centuries by different scribes, in different cities, under different political regimes. And yet, across those copies, its most unsettling feature remains remarkably stable. Before the flood, before the recalibration of time into something recognisably human, kings ruled for spans that stretch far beyond any biological explanation currently accepted. What is often overlooked is not the length of these reigns, but the confidence with which they are stated. There is no hesitation in the text, no signal that the numbers are symbolic, no margin note suggesting doubt. The list does not ask to be believed. It assumes belief has already been settled. Modern readers encounter the king list as an artifact frozen behind glass, already framed as a problem to be solved. But in its original context, it functioned as something far more mundane. It was not prophecy. It was not myth in the modern sense. It was a document of legitimacy, a ledger of authority, a quiet assertion that power had an origin, and that origin lay beyond ordinary human beginnings. The opening line alone carries a weight that resists translation. Kingship, it says, descended from heaven. Not imagined, not invented, descended. The verb matters. It implies movement, direction, and intention. Something was elsewhere, and then it was not. Something crossed a boundary. Scholars have long attempted to soften this language, to render it metaphorical, to suggest that heaven simply meant the divine sanction of rule. But that interpretation raises its own questions. Why would legitimacy require such extraordinary temporal inflation? Why not simply say that the gods favoured the first kings, as later cultures often did? Why insist instead on reigns lasting tens of thousands of years, attached to specific names, ruling from specific cities that archaeology confirms did exist? Some argue that these numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. Others suggest they encode lunar cycles, seasonal counts, or symbolic numerology. These theories are not without merit. Ancient cultures did think differently about time, but none of these explanations fully resolve the pattern. The king list does not behave like an abstract cosmology. It behaves like a record struggling to compress something it no longer fully understands. What complicates matters further is what happens after the flood. The text does not gradually transition into human-scale reigns. It does not ease the listener into a new era. It snaps. Reign lengths collapse from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, then to decades, almost immediately. The list continues, unbroken, as if nothing unusual has occurred. Yet everything has changed. This abruptness suggests not evolution, but interruption. If the long reigns were merely symbolic, why abandon them so suddenly? Symbolic systems tend to persist. They fade slowly, reshaped by reinterpretation. Here, something forces a recalibration. Time itself seems to fracture. The flood is often cited as the cause, but the flood explanation only shifts the mystery rather than resolving it. Flood narratives across cultures describe destruction, yes, but they also describe survival. Knowledge carried forward, lineages preserved. If memory survived, why did lifespan not? Why did authority lose its earlier scale? It is tempting to conclude that the pre-flood kings never existed as described. But that conclusion rests on an assumption that ancient scribes lacked critical judgment. In reality, these same cultures preserved multiple versions of myths, contradictions, and rival accounts side by side. They were not afraid of complexity, which makes the uniformity of the king list structure more striking, not less. Even more curious is what the list does not say. There is no physical description of these early kings, no dramatization of their bodies or abilities, no attempt to awe the reader with spectacle. Their difference is expressed almost entirely through duration. Time becomes the marker of otherness. Longevity, in ancient thought, was not merely biological, it was moral, cosmic, and metaphysical. To live longer was to be closer to origins, closer to the structure of the world itself. A king who ruled for 36,000 years was not just powerful, he was anchored to a deeper layer of reality. This framing resonates with patterns found elsewhere. In early Egyptian tradition, the first rulers were not humans as later understood, but beings whose reigns spanned vast stretches before the first dynasty. In Hindu cosmology, kingship emerges within cycles so large they dwarf recorded history. In each case, the farther back one looks, the less human time appears. What if these traditions are not exaggerating the past but remembering it imperfectly? As writing systems evolved and generations passed, memory would have compressed. Names would survive longer than contexts. Durations might remain even after their meaning blurred. What began as a description of something qualitatively different could, over centuries, be flattened into numbers that now seem absurd. The discomfort modern scholars feel may stem not from implausibility, but from proximity. The king list is not far enough removed to be safely myth. It sits too close to the birth of writing, too entangled with real cities and real kings. It resists the comfort of dismissal, and perhaps that resistance is its purpose, not intentional but structural. A record that survived because it was useful, yet carried within it a residue of something no longer explainable. If the earliest rulers were non-human, not necessarily in form but in nature, then the king list is not claiming divinity. It is documenting inheritance, humanity stepping into roles once occupied by others, authority shrinking, time accelerating. The real question may not be whether the list is true or false, but why it was never fully rewritten to make sense. Why leave the impossible at the beginning of history, like a crack in the foundation? Because once that crack is acknowledged, it becomes difficult to say where the human story truly begins, and whether it began alone. Time becomes unsettling when it refuses to behave the way the body expects. A reign of 40 years fits neatly within the imagination. It aligns with bones aging, with seasons repeating, with a slow accumulation of memory. But when a reign stretches across thousands of years, the imagination falters, not because the number is large, but because it breaks the relationship between authority and mortality. Power, in such a frame, is no longer something inherited by children or lost through decay. It becomes something static, almost geological. The objection usually raised at this point is biological. No organism known to modern science lives for tens of thousands of years. Cells divide, errors accumulate, entropy asserts itself. And yet this objection assumes that the ancient texts were attempting to describe bodies in the same way modern biology does. They were not. They were describing duration as a quality of being, not merely a count of heartbeats. In early cosmologies, time itself was not uniform. It thickened near origins and thinned as the world moved away from them. The farther one travelled from the moment of creation, the faster things seemed to decay. Lifespans shortened, memory fragmented, order required enforcement rather than maintenance. Longevity, then, was not just about living longer, it was about existing closer to the source of structure. Seen this way, the immense reigns attributed to early kings do not read like boasts, they read like coordinates. Some researchers have proposed that these numbers encode symbolic systems. base 60 mathematics, astronomical cycles, or ritual calendars. These interpretations are careful, disciplined, and intellectually honest. But they often treat the numbers as puzzles rather than residues, as if meaning were intentionally hidden rather than partially lost. There is another possibility that receives less attention because it sits uncomfortably between disciplines. What if these reigns reflect a memory of beings whose relationship to time was fundamentally different from ours? Not because they were immortal in the mythic sense, but because they operated within a different temporal framework. This does not require imagining fantastical creatures. It only requires acknowledging that consciousness, metabolism, and perception need not scale identically across all forms of intelligence. Even within known life, time is experienced differently. A mayfly lives for hours. A bristlecone pine persists for millennia. Neither experiences duration the way humans do. Ancient texts rarely describe the early rulers as biologically human. They are not said to be born, to age, or to die in familiar ways. Their transitions are described obliquely. They depart, they ascend, they are taken, or kingship moves elsewhere. Death, as later understood, is curiously absent. This absence becomes more striking when contrasted with later king lists, where death is explicit and frequent. Human rulers die in battle, from illness, from betrayal. Their reigns end abruptly. The tone shifts. Mortality enters the record. The boundary between these two modes is sharp, and sharp boundaries usually mark events rather than metaphors. Geological evidence suggests that around the end of the last ice age, the Earth underwent rapid environmental shifts. Sea levels rose, climates destabilized. Entire regions became uninhabitable within generations. Human populations fragmented and migrated. Memory, under such pressure, would have been compressed and distorted, but not erased. If a previous order existed, one in which authority was centralized, stable, and long-lasting, it would not survive such disruption intact. It would fracture. Roles would be inherited without full understanding. Time would be recalibrated to human limits. The idea that early rulers were non-human may not refer to appearance at all. It may refer to scale, duration, embeddedness within systems humans later only partially grasped. A king who rules for 28,800 years may be less a person than a function, a stabilizing presence persisting across epochs. This interpretation unsettles because it reframes kingship itself. Authority ceases to be an invention and becomes a residue, something learned by imitation rather than created from scratch. Across ancient cultures, rulers are repeatedly described as intermediaries rather than originators. They receive laws, they maintain balance, they uphold cosmic order that predates them. In later eras, this language becomes ceremonial. In earlier ones, it feels literal. There is also the recurring suggestion that something was lost, that the world once operated under conditions no longer accessible, that lifespans shortened not because of moral failure, but because the environment itself changed, physically, energetically, perhaps even temporally. Modern science is cautious about such speculation, and rightly so. But it also acknowledges that time is not as simple as once believed. Relativity has shown that duration is not absolute. Physics allows for time to behave differently under different conditions of gravity, energy, and scale. Ancient people did not speak in equations, but they were attentive observers of patterns. They tracked stars, seasons, and cycles with extraordinary precision. Their myths often functioned as memory systems rather than explanations. If the early reigns reflect an era when time itself felt slower, thicker, then the numbers may not be exaggerations. They may be attempts to preserve a sensation that language could no longer support. The discomfort returns here. Because if time once behaved differently, and if authority was once anchored within that difference, then the shift to human-scale reigns marks more than political change. It marks a narrowing of reality. The question, then, is not whether those early kings lived for thousands of years in the way humans measure life today. The question is what kind of world allows such claims to make sense at all. And once that question is allowed to linger, it leads inevitably forward, toward the moment when those rulers disappear, when time accelerates, and when humanity is left holding institutions whose original purpose it no longer fully remembers. What becomes unsettling is not that early civilizations imagined rulers before themselves, but that they agreed, across distance and culture, on the nature of that inheritance. In the oldest strata of human memory, kingship does not emerge from negotiation or conquest. It arrives already formed. Laws are not debated, they are received. Cities are not founded as experiments. They are laid out according to patterns that appear complete from the beginning. This sense of pre-structure appears again and again, as if humanity stepped into rooms already furnished. In Mesopotamia, the first cities are not described as crude beginnings. They appear suddenly with temples, granaries, irrigation systems, and administrative hierarchies already in place. Archaeology confirms this abruptness. The leap from scattered villages to complex urban centres occurs faster than expected, leaving little trace of incremental development. The usual explanation invokes innovation, population pressure, and favourable geography. These factors matter, but they do not explain the confidence embedded in the earliest institutions. Egypt tells a similar story. Before the first dynasty, before human pharaohs with known tombs and biographies, there exists a shadowy era of rulers described as divine or semi-divine. They are not portrayed as creators of civilization, but as its custodians. Order, or ma'at, is not invented by humans. It is maintained on their behalf. When the first mortal kings take power, their role is explicitly framed as imitation. In early Chinese tradition, the earliest sovereigns are culture bringers rather than conquerors. They teach writing, agriculture, and governance, then recede. Their reigns stretch beyond plausible lifespans, not because the texts seek to deceive, but because they are not attempting biography. They are marking distance from something no longer present. In the Andes, lineages trace their authority back to beings who emerged before the current world. These ancestors are often described as stepping aside once humanity is prepared to govern itself. The language is careful, power is transferred, not seized. What unites these traditions is not the presence of gods, but the absence of rebellion. Humanity does not overthrow its predecessors. There is no global myth of humans defeating their makers. Instead, there is withdrawal, departure, silence. This absence of conflict is strange. Human societies rarely relinquish power peacefully, yet the memory preserved across cultures suggests a handover rather than a collapse. Authority diminishes not through revolution, but through absence. If the early rulers were non-human, their difference may not have been expressed in form, but in function. They did not rule through coercion. They maintained conditions, stability, continuity. Their authority seems tied to environmental and cosmic balance, rather than political dominance. This may explain why later humans struggle to replicate what they inherited. Megalithic architecture appears early and then degrades. Precision stonework gives way to smaller, less exact constructions. Knowledge fragments rather than accumulates. This pattern troubles the linear narrative of progress. It also complicates the idea that myth is merely symbolic. Symbols tend to grow richer over time. Here the opposite occurs. The farther from the beginning one travels, the thinner the memory becomes. There are hints that early humans understood this loss. Laments appear in ancient texts, mourning a previous age of harmony and abundance. These are not utopian fantasies. They are restrained, almost administrative in tone. Something functioned differently. Something was easier. Something no longer holds. If non-human kings once ruled, their disappearance may not have been dramatic. It may have been environmental. A shift in climate, radiation, atmospheric composition, or geomagnetic stability could render certain forms of life unsustainable. What survives is not necessarily superior, only adaptable. Humans in this view are not replacements, but inheritors under constraint. We inherit tools without manuals, structures without context, rituals whose original purpose has faded. Over time, reverence replaces understanding. This may be why early texts emphasize obedience rather than innovation. The role of the human king is not to improve the system, but to preserve it. Change is dangerous. Deviation invites collapse, and yet collapse comes anyway. The flood narratives that appear across cultures may encode this transition, not necessarily as a single global event, but as a convergence of regional catastrophes remembered collectively. Water becomes the symbol because it erases without discrimination. It leaves behind survivors without continuity. After the flood, kingship changes, authority becomes fragile, violence enters the record, mortality asserts itself, the divine distance between ruler and ruled collapses. Kings become men who must justify their power rather than embody it. If there were non-human kings before humans, their rule may not have been remembered because it was benevolent or cruel, but because it was stable. Stability, once lost, becomes myth. The persistence of these stories suggests that humanity sensed the difference, even if it could not articulate it. Something once held the world together more tightly. Something maintained coherence across timescales no longer accessible. What remains is imitation. Crowns, thrones, rituals, titles, all pointing backward toward a model that no longer exists. And as these symbols are repeated across generations, stripped of their original context, they begin to feel theatrical. Power becomes performance. Authority becomes persuasion. The lingering question is not who those early rulers were, but what conditions allowed them to rule at all, and whether those conditions could ever return. Because if humanity did not originate civilization, but inherited it in a diminished state, then the future may not be a path forward, but a struggle to remember what was lost. There is a quiet insistence in the language of ancient texts, a repetition so subtle it often goes unnoticed. The earliest rulers do not rise, they do not seize power, they do not emerge from the crowd, they arrive. Again and again, authority is described as something that descends. It is placed, it is brought down. The direction matters. Power moves from above to below, from elsewhere into the human world. This pattern appears so consistently that it begins to feel less like metaphor and more like residue, language left behind after the original meaning has thinned. In the Sumerian texts, kingship descends from heaven. In Egypt, the earliest rulers are said to have come from the sky, or to have ruled in an age when gods still walked among the land. In Mesoamerican traditions, founders arrive from distant horizons or emerge after the world itself has been reset. In China, early sovereigns are not born into chaos. They step into an already ordered cosmos and align themselves with it. The common interpretation treats these descriptions as symbolic attempts to legitimize authority. Heaven grants permission. The sky sanctifies the throne. But this explanation assumes that ancient people required external validation for power in a way modern societies do. It also assumes that metaphor was the primary language of early memory. Yet the consistency of descent language across cultures suggests something else. It suggests an attempt to preserve a directional truth. Authority did not originate at ground level. It was not negotiated among equals. It came from somewhere that was not fully accessible. What if descent was not symbolic, but spatial or contextual? What if it described a transition between modes of existence rather than physical movement? Ancient texts rarely describe the moment of arrival in detail. They assume it as known. The focus is not on how these rulers came, but on what followed. Order stabilizes, calendars align, agriculture becomes predictable, law appears fully formed. This completeness is difficult to reconcile with gradual development. Systems of such complexity usually leave traces of experimentation, trial and error, failure. But in the earliest records there is very little evidence of confusion. There is continuity without explanation. Later generations inherit these systems without understanding their origin. Ritual replaces function. Ceremony replaces mechanism. The language becomes reverent because comprehension has been lost. This shift can be felt in the way gods slowly replace rulers. What were once governing figures become divine abstractions. Names remain, but roles change. Authority migrates from presence to myth. This transition is not abrupt. It unfolds across centuries. As the memory of descent fades, the idea of divine ancestry takes its place. Kings no longer claim to have come from elsewhere. They claim to be descended from those who did. This subtle change marks a turning point, earning. Power is no longer external, it is genealogical. Blood replaces proximity. And with that shift comes fragility. If the earliest rulers were non-human, their legitimacy did not depend on lineage. They did not reproduce authority biologically. They embodied it structurally. When they left, humanity attempted to preserve power by imitating form rather than substance. This may explain why early kings were often described as intermediaries rather than masters. They listened. They interpreted. They maintained alignment between realms rather than enforcing dominance. As those realms became more distant, mediation became performance. Authority became louder. Violence became necessary. The idea that early kings descended rather than rose also complicates modern assumptions about progress. It suggests that the earliest phase of civilization was not primitive, but foundational. That what followed was not advancement, but adaptation under constraint. Archaeology occasionally hints at this inversion. The oldest constructions are often the most precise, the earliest stonework the most enduring. Later efforts are larger but less refined, more impressive but less exact. This pattern suggests loss rather than growth. If non-human rulers once governed, their departure may not have been chosen. Environmental shifts could render their mode of existence unsustainable. The same catastrophe that shortened lifespans could have forced withdrawal. What remains is not a vacuum, but a handover under duress. Humanity receives the world mid-function. The systems still operate, but maintenance becomes difficult. Over time, the original operators fade into legend. What survives is language that no longer fits experience. Words like heaven stretch to accommodate what can no longer be described. Direction replaces description. Above replaces elsewhere. This may be why ancient religions emphasize verticality, mountains, towers, ziggurats. Pyramids, structures that reach upward not to impress but to reconnect, to re-establish alignment with something that once descended. The irony is that as societies became more complex, their understanding of origins became thinner. Knowledge accumulated horizontally while depth eroded. Memory survived in fragments, encoded in ritual rather than explanation. The descent of kingship becomes a story rather than an event. Yet the story persists, stubbornly resisting erasure. Because if authority once came from elsewhere, then humanity's role has always been provisional, steward rather than owner, custodian rather than creator. And if that is true, then the disappearance of the early rulers is not merely a historical curiosity. It is the moment when responsibility shifted, when humanity was left alone with systems it did not fully design, and with consequences it may not yet understand. The question that remains is not where those rulers went, but whether their departure was final, or merely the beginning of a longer absence still unfolding. What remains most unsettling is not what the ancient texts describe, but what they carefully avoid describing. If early rulers were imagined as monsters, giants, or creatures of excess, dismissal would be easy. Spectacle invites skepticism, but instead the descriptions are restrained, almost austere. The earliest kings are not defined by claws or wings or unnatural faces. Their difference is expressed through subtler qualities: radiance, voice, weight, and presence. Qualities that resist illustration but linger in memory. They are said to shine, not glow. Their speech carries authority rather than volume. Their presence stabilizes rather than dominates. These are not the traits of mythic beasts. They are the traits of something closer, something familiar enough to rule, yet distant enough to unsettle. Ancient cultures were capable of imagining monsters. They did so freely elsewhere. Hybrid creatures populate their margins. Chaos is vividly personified, which makes the restraint surrounding early rulers deliberate rather than accidental. The texts do not say these kings looked different. They imply that they were different. In Sumerian literature, the early rulers are often associated with brilliance, with a kind of luminosity that is neither purely physical nor entirely symbolic. This radiance is not described as blinding. It is steady, controlled, almost administrative. Light, here, functions as a marker of alignment rather than power. In Egypt, divine rulers are associated with the concept of K, an animating force that distinguishes living presence from mere form. The early kings possessed this force in abundance. Later pharaohs must continually renew it through ritual. The difference is telling. What was once inherent becomes something that must be maintained artificially. Across cultures, the voice of early rulers carries unusual weight. Commands are not enforced through punishment, but through recognition. Words align rather than coerce. Law feels less like restriction and more like gravity. This emphasis on voice and presence suggests that authority once operated through resonance rather than violence. Order emerged because systems responded, not because they were forced. Such a mode of governance would require rulers whose internal coherence exceeded that of the populations they governed. Not morally superior, but structurally stable. Less reactive, more consistent. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the difference between early rulers and later humans was not intelligence or strength, but integration? A coherence between cognition, environment, and time that later humanity lost. Modern neuroscience acknowledges that coherence matters. Systems function best when signals align. Noise disrupts, fragmentation degrades performance. Ancient descriptions of early rulers often emphasize harmony rather than domination. They do not rule against nature, they rule with it. This may explain why ancient texts associate the disappearance of these rulers with the breakdown of balance. Weather becomes erratic, floods occur, famine spreads, social order fractures. The loss of rulers is mirrored by the loss of predictability. In this light, non-human does not mean alien, it means non-fragmented. Later myths transform this difference into morality. The golden age, the fall. But beneath the moral framing lies a functional observation. Something once worked more smoothly. The physical absence of grotesque description may also reflect the limits of language. If the difference was internal, metabolic, cognitive, temporal, it would resist portrayal. You cannot draw coherence. You can only feel its absence. This absence may be why later cultures turn to symbols, crowns, halos, thrones. These are not representations of power. They are attempts to anchor it, to give form to something that once required none. The halo, for instance, does not depict light emitted from the head. It marks a boundary, a distinction between the individual and the surrounding world. It signals presence rather than appearance. Similarly, the emphasis on voice in later religious traditions, commandments spoken, names invoked, may echo an earlier mode of authority that functioned through sound rather than force, resonance rather than threat. Ancient architecture supports this possibility. Early sacred spaces are often acoustically precise. Stone chambers amplify specific frequencies. Sound carries intention. Voice becomes environment. If early rulers operated within such spaces, their authority may have been less about issuing orders and more about maintaining resonance, a role closer to conductor than tyrant. This interpretation reframes the idea of kingship entirely. Ruling becomes a form of tuning, maintaining alignment between systems that naturally drift toward disorder. When such rulers disappear, humanity inherits the instruments, but not the ear. Structures remain, but their original function is misinterpreted. Ritual becomes rigid. Law becomes punitive. Violence increases not because humans are cruel, but because coherence has been lost. Force replaces resonance. This shift is visible in the archaeological record. Weapons proliferate. Fortifications appear. Graves fill with signs of conflict. Authority must now be defended. The early texts do not mourn the rulers themselves. They mourn the loss of order. The departure of those beings is felt indirectly through the unravelling that follows. What if the true difference between early rulers and later humans was not species but state? A mode of being no longer accessible under changed conditions. If that were the case, calling them non-human would be both accurate and misleading. They would not be other in form but other in integration, a version of intelligence that required an environment no longer present. Their disappearance would not require invasion or rebellion. It would require only a shift, subtle, cumulative, irreversible. And humanity, stepping into their absence, would inherit a world still echoing with structures built for a different mode of governance. The lingering question is not whether these rulers existed as described, but why their memory insists on restraint, why ancient cultures chose to describe difference through absence rather than spectacle. Perhaps because spectacle distracts, and what these texts preserve is not awe, but loss. A quiet recognition that something once held the world together more gently, and that whatever it was, it did not need to look monstrous to be non-human. What follows the age of long-lived rulers is not explanation, but quiet. Across ancient records, the transition is marked with surprising restraint. The reigns shorten, names change, the tone becomes practical. There is no ceremony for the end of the previous order. No farewell, no account of resistance. The texts simply move on, as though lingering would be dangerous or futile. The flood is often named, but rarely described in detail where it matters most. Water arrives, land disappears, survivors emerge, and then kingship resumes, smaller, frailer, unmistakably human. The scale collapses, and with it, the assumption that authority belongs to beings who endure beyond generations. What is unsettling is how consistent this pattern is. From Mesopotamia to the Indus, from the Nile to the Yellow River, a rupture appears, sometimes remembered as water, sometimes as fire, sometimes as darkness, but always as interruption. Before it, rulers persist beyond memory. After it, they age, weaken, and die. If this were merely myth, one would expect variation, drama, moral emphasis, punishment and redemption. Instead, the accounts behave like damaged records. Something important is missing, but the structure remains. The silence itself becomes a clue. In Sumerian tradition, the flood divides time cleanly. Before it, reigns are measured in tens of thousands of years. After it, they shrink abruptly to hundreds. There is no gradual decline, no transitional figures bridging the two eras. The cut is sharp, as though a parameter has changed. Biology alone cannot explain this. Environmental catastrophe can shorten lifespans, but not with such uniformity across rulers. What changes here is not health, but expectation. The texts no longer imagine kings who persist beyond natural limits. It is as though that possibility has vanished from the conceptual landscape. The same pattern appears elsewhere. Egyptian king lists acknowledge an earlier era ruled by gods or semi-divine beings, followed by the first human dynasties. But the transition is compressed, almost evasive. The gods rule, then they do not. Human kings appear, already burdened with mortality. In many cultures, this shift is accompanied by a subtle change in responsibility. Early rulers maintain cosmic balance simply by existing. Later kings must enforce order actively. Law becomes codified. Punishment becomes visible. The world no longer holds itself together. This change suggests that something more than leadership was lost. A stabilizing presence may have vanished, something that made governance effortless because it aligned with underlying conditions. Geology offers an uncomfortable parallel. Around the end of the last ice age, the planet undergoes rapid destabilization. Ice sheets melt. Sea levels rise dramatically. Coastlines vanish. Weather patterns shift. Entire ecosystems reorganize within a few thousand years. Human societies are forced to adapt quickly. Migration accelerates. Memory fragments. Oral traditions strain under pressure. If an earlier form of governance depended on environmental stability, or on conditions that no longer existed, it would not survive such upheaval. Withdrawal, rather than destruction, becomes plausible. The flood, then, may not be a single event, but a compression of many disruptions into one symbol. Water becomes shorthand for erasure, for the loss of continuity. What is rarely considered is that the flood does not merely reset humanity, it resets authority. It marks the end of rulers who do not die and the beginning of rulers who must. After the flood, kingship becomes hereditary, contested, fragile. Power is no longer assumed, it must be defended. Genealogy replaces duration as the marker of legitimacy. This change is profound. Authority becomes biological. Time becomes linear. History begins to behave the way modern historians expect it to. The silence about what happened to the earlier rulers may reflect ignorance, but it may also reflect something else. A recognition that explanation would not help, that whatever caused the disappearance was not an enemy to be defeated, but a condition to be endured. In some traditions, the earlier rulers do not die, they retreat, they ascend, they sleep. The language is ambiguous. Absence replaces annihilation. This ambiguity allows memory to persist without confrontation. It preserves reverence while acknowledging loss. The psychological effect of such a transition would be immense. Humanity inherits a world no longer maintained by those who built it. The burden of continuity shifts abruptly. Responsibility arrives before readiness. Ritual intensifies after this point. Offerings increase. Sacrifice becomes common. Appeasement replaces alignment. Humans attempt to call back what has gone, not realizing that the conditions which allowed it to exist are no longer present. The silence deepens. The absence of direct confrontation in these stories may also signal fear, not of the rulers themselves, but of the knowledge of their disappearance. To understand why something superior withdrew would require confronting the fragility of the world itself. Better perhaps to remember the rulers dimly and move on. Yet the memory lingers. It appears in laments, in Golden Age myths, in the persistent sense that something essential has been lost, that the present is thinner than the past. The flood becomes a hinge not because it explains, but because it divides. It marks the moment when humanity becomes alone in a way it had not been before. From that point on, history accelerates, innovation increases, violence intensifies, complexity multiplies. But something else diminishes: continuity, coherence, the sense of being held within a larger order. If non-human kings once ruled, their absence is not remembered as tyranny overcome, but as stability withdrawn. And the question that lingers is not whether they could have survived the flood, but whether the world that followed could ever sustain them again. Because if their disappearance was caused not by a rebellion, but by change itself, then their absence is not a closed chapter. It is an ongoing condition, one that humanity has been navigating ever since, without fully remembering when or why it began. What is often described as a beginning may be better understood as a recovery. After the rupture, whether remembered as flood, darkness, or fire, the world resumes, but unevenly. Settlements reappear in unfamiliar places. Technologies surface already mature yet strangely isolated. Knowledge seems to arrive in pockets rather than unfolding smoothly. This unevenness is difficult to reconcile with a clean restart. It feels more like salvage. Across continents, early post-catastrophe societies display an odd combination of sophistication and amnesia. Agriculture is practiced with confidence, yet its origins are obscure. Monumental architecture emerges without clear developmental stages. Measurement systems appear standardized, as though inherited rather than invented. This pattern suggests that the reset did not erase everything. It disrupted continuity without wiping the slate clean. What survived did so incompletely, carried by people who remembered functions but not foundations. If non-human rulers once maintained coherence across systems, environmental, social, temporal, their absence would not simply collapse civilization, it would expose it to drift. Human societies would persist, but without the stabilizing context that once unified them. Geological records confirm that the period following the last ice age was anything but gentle. Meltwater pulses reshaped coastlines. Entire regions were submerged within generations. Populations were displaced repeatedly. Such conditions favor improvisation over preservation. Memory under these circumstances becomes selective. Practical knowledge survives. Explanatory frameworks do not. This may explain why myths proliferate after catastrophe. Myth is not an attempt to deceive. It is an attempt to remember when precision is no longer possible. It compresses complexity into narrative. It preserves orientation without detail. The flood myths that spread across cultures may encode not a single event, but a prolonged era of instability. Water becomes the dominant symbol because it dissolves boundaries. It erases markers. It leaves survivors unmoored. In such a world, the disappearance of long-lived rulers would be felt not as an act but as a condition. The environment itself no longer supports them. Their withdrawal becomes synonymous with chaos. This perspective reframes the idea of reset civilizations. Rather than imagining a total collapse followed by reinvention, it suggests repeated phases of inheritance under stress. Each reset strips away context while preserving fragments. Over time, fragments become foundations. Systems are rebuilt atop misunderstood remnants. Architecture is replicated without knowing why certain proportions mattered. Rituals persist after their original function fades. Humanity becomes skilled at maintenance without comprehension. This skill is not trivial. It allows survival, it allows expansion, but it also limits imagination. When systems function without explanation, questioning them feels dangerous. The memory of non-human rulers thus becomes diluted. Their role shifts from governance to myth. Their absence becomes moralized. Stories of punishment and failure replace accounts of environmental change. This moral framing serves a psychological purpose. It gives meaning to loss. It assigns blame where explanation is unavailable, but beneath the moral surface traces of a different memory remain. The insistence that something ended, that time itself changed. That rulers once endured beyond generations and then did not. Modern science, with its emphasis on gradualism, struggles with such narratives. Yet geology itself acknowledges punctuated equilibrium, long periods of stability interrupted by rapid change. Biology recognizes bottlenecks. Systems collapse not because they are weak, but because conditions shift. If early governance depended on conditions that vanished, then its disappearance would be as natural as the extinction of species adapted to specific environments. This does not require attributing intention or morality. It requires only accepting that intelligence and authority may be context-dependent. Humanity's rise, then, is not a triumph over predecessors, but an adaptation to absence. We become rulers not because we are superior, but because we remain. This reframing alters how progress is understood. Advancement becomes compensation. Innovation becomes necessity. Complexity grows not from abundance, but from loss. The archaeological record supports this uneasy view. Early post-catastrophe cultures often show bursts of ingenuity under constraint. Tools diversify. Social structures become elaborate. Hierarchies harden. Control replaces alignment. The memory of earlier rulers lingers as unease, a sense that something once managed complexity effortlessly. That the current struggle is not inherent, but inherited. This may be why ancient texts repeatedly emphasize remembrance. Forgetting is portrayed as danger. Knowledge must be preserved not to innovate, but to avoid collapse. Yet preservation without context breeds rigidity. Systems become brittle. When they fail catastrophically. The cycles continue. Reset civilizations, then, are not separate stories. They are iterations of the same pattern. Stability maintained by conditions beyond human control, followed by disruption, followed by human improvisation. If non-human kings once ruled, their absence marks the first reset, not because it erased humanity, but because it changed the rules under which authority could exist. From that point on, kingship becomes an approximation, a role played rather than embodied. Symbols replace presence. Ritual replaces function. The world continues, but differently. And the deeper question emerges quietly beneath the surface of history, whether the conditions that once allowed such rulers to exist are truly gone, or merely dormant, waiting for alignment to return. Because if civilization has reset before, without fully understanding what was lost, there is no guarantee that future resets will be kinder. And the memory of those earlier rulers, preserved imperfectly in myth and stone, may be less a relic of the past than a warning about the fragility of the present. What survives catastrophe is not truth, but permission. After the rupture, after authority shrinks to human scale, something subtler begins to form. Memory does not disappear outright. It is filtered, curated, managed. What remains legible is what can be carried safely into the new order. What threatens stability is softened, allegorized, or quietly set aside. This process does not require conspiracy. It requires only institutions. Priesthoods emerge early in post-catastrophe societies. Scribes follow soon after. Their role is preservation, but preservation is never neutral. To preserve is to choose. To choose is to shape. In Mesopotamia, the same scribal class that recorded kingship also administered temples, managed surplus, and interpreted omens. They were not historians in the modern sense. They were custodians of continuity. Their task was not to question origins, but to stabilize the present. When memories of non-human rulers persist, they are reframed. What was once administrative becomes sacred. What was once functional becomes moral. Authority shifts from presence to doctrine. This is not deception. It is compression under pressure. A society rebuilding after disruption cannot afford ambiguity at its foundation. Uncertainty erodes obedience. Questions about who ruled before humans invite questions about who should rule now. So memory is reorganized into forms that support cohesion. Kings become descendants of gods rather than successors to non-human governors. Longevity becomes virtue rather than condition. The past is elevated beyond reach. This reframing can be observed in the evolution of early texts. Older layers are pragmatic, sparse, unconcerned with justification. Later layers grow ornate, moral, explanatory. The added detail does not clarify, it distances. As generations pass, the difference between record and reverence widens. What was once a ledger becomes scripture. What was once inherited becomes revealed. This shift alters how knowledge is transmitted. Inquiry becomes risky. Preservation becomes obedience. To question origins is to question authority itself. In such a system, only certain forms of curiosity are tolerated. Technical knowledge flourishes, astronomy, architecture, agriculture, because it serves survival. Ontological questions recede because they destabilize hierarchy. The memory of earlier rulers thus survives only where it can be contained. In myth, in symbol, in ritual reenactment stripped of explanation. This containment is not uniform. Some cultures preserve more fragments than others. Some allow ambiguity to linger. Others enforce coherence more strictly. Over time, the most unsettling details are those least discussed. The immense reigns, the abrupt transitions, the suggestion that humanity did not originate governance. These details are not erased, they are marginalized. By the time later empires inherit these traditions, the margins have hardened. What once unsettled becomes invisible through familiarity. The strange becomes decorative. Modern scholars often assume that this process culminated in classical antiquity, but evidence suggests it continued well into recorded history. Early religious councils standardized texts. Alternative genealogies were discarded. Chronologies were compressed to fit theological frameworks. This does not require malicious intent. It reflects the needs of institutions tasked with maintaining unity across expanding populations. A civilization that admits discontinuity at its core invites fracture, and yet traces persist. They surface in contradictions, in overlapping timelines, in kings who rule impossibly long and then vanish without explanation. These traces behave like pressure points. They attract attention not because they are loud, but because they resist smoothing. The discomfort they provoke may explain why certain questions fell out of favour. Why early comparative mythologists hesitated. Why 19th century researchers who noticed global patterns of pre-human rulership quietly redirected their focus. To pursue such questions requires tolerating instability. It requires admitting that history may not be linear, and that humanity may not occupy the position it assumes. Institutions rarely reward such admissions. The management of memory thus becomes a survival strategy. It allows societies to move forward without resolving the past, but it comes at a cost. The cost is depth. When memory is curated to protect cohesion, it loses its capacity to warn. Patterns are flattened, cycles are obscured, each collapse feels unprecedented. This may be why civilizations repeat mistakes they appear to remember. The memory preserved is moral rather than structural. It teaches humility without teaching mechanism. The memory of non-human rulers, stripped of context, becomes a story about gods rather than governance. It warns against hubris, but not against misalignment. What is lost is the sense that authority itself is conditional, that it depends on environments, coherence, and constraints beyond will. If earlier rulers were non-human not by form but by state, then forgetting that state becomes dangerous. Humanity attempts to reproduce authority through symbols and force, unaware that the original conditions are absent. Institutions preserve order, but they also preserve blind spots. The lingering fragments, long reigns, abrupt resets, silent transitions, persist because they were never fully integrated. They remain as unresolved artifacts within the narrative. They whisper rather than speak, and perhaps that is why they endure. Not as answers, but as pressure. A reminder that something about the past does not fit comfortably within the present. As long as these fragments remain, history cannot fully close. It remains slightly ajar, allowing questions to seep through. The question now is not whether memory was managed, but whether it can be unlearned. Because if humanity inherited governance without its original context, then rediscovering that context may require undoing centuries of careful forgetting. And that process, slow, unsettling, destabilizing, may be the most dangerous transition of all. At a certain distance, gods begin to behave like metaphors. This transformation does not happen suddenly. It unfolds quietly, over generations, as memory thins and explanation becomes inconvenient. What was once described as presence becomes principle. What once ruled becomes what is said to rule. Authority retreats from the world and settles into language. In the earliest layers of tradition, rulers are described as acting. They judge, they assign, they stabilize. Their decisions have immediate consequences. But as time passes, those actions are retold less as events and more as exemplars. The ruler becomes a symbol of order rather than its operator. This shift is subtle but decisive. When rulers are present, authority is external and observable. When they become metaphors, authority becomes interpretive. It must be explained, justified, argued. This is where theology begins to replace governance. The transformation is visible in how ancient texts evolve. Earlier accounts are sparse and procedural. Later retellings expand, moralize, and abstract. The same figures remain, but their function changes. They no longer maintain the world. They represent ideas about it. Gods become virtues. Kings become archetypes. Longevity becomes righteousness. This evolution is often framed as intellectual progress, a maturation of thought. But it may also reflect a loss of access. When direct experience fades, abstraction fills the gap. If non-human rulers once governed through presence and coherence, their absence would force societies to preserve order symbolically. Metaphor becomes a prosthetic for missing function. This helps explain why ancient religions emphasize repetition. Ritual reenacts what no longer occurs. Prayer calls what no longer answers. Symbol replaces mechanism. The transition from ruler to God is not elevation. It is displacement. Once authority is metaphorical, it can be reinterpreted endlessly. Different factions claim alignment with the same symbol. Disputes multiply. Orthodoxy becomes necessary to prevent fragmentation. This necessity gives rise to doctrine. Doctrine stabilizes belief, but it also narrows interpretation. Ambiguity, once tolerated, becomes dangerous. The memory of earlier rulers thus becomes increasingly constrained. They are no longer allowed to be ambiguous figures who ruled before humans. They must fit moral frameworks. They must justify current power structures. This pressure reshapes narratives. Long reigns become allegories for virtue. Dissent becomes spiritual enlightenment. Departure becomes transcendence. What is lost is the sense that these figures once occupied the same world as humans, under different conditions. Theologization of authority serves an important social function. It allows continuity without explanation. It binds communities through shared belief. But it also seals off certain questions. Questions about origin become questions of faith rather than investigation. To ask whether gods once ruled the earth becomes heresy rather than curiosity. This shift changes how history is written. Events are arranged to support doctrine. Chronologies are compressed or expanded to fit prophecy. Contradictions are harmonized. The past becomes coherent, but less accurate. What remains troubling is that traces of the earlier understanding persist. They surface in moments of tension, where metaphor fails to fully absorb memory. Long reigns remain stubbornly literal in some texts. The language of dissent resists allegory. Floods interrupt narratives without moral resolution. These residues suggest that the metaphorization of gods was incomplete, that something resisted abstraction. Modern readers often assume that ancient people believed their gods were symbolic, but evidence suggests the opposite. Symbolism increases as belief in literal presence declines. The gods become less real as they become more meaningful. This paradox lies at the heart of the transition. Meaning expands as reality recedes. The story becomes richer as the world becomes poorer. If early rulers were non-human in the sense of operating under different conditions of time and coherence, then turning them into metaphors is not reinterpretation, it is adaptation. Human societies, unable to replicate the original mode of governance, preserve its shadow. They build elaborate systems of belief around absence. This adaptation is not failure, it is survival, but it comes with consequences. When authority is metaphorical, it can be manipulated. Symbols can be claimed, narratives can be revised, power becomes negotiable in ways it was not before. This negotiability fuels both creativity and conflict. Philosophies flourish, empires clash, innovation accelerates. But something else is lost, the sense that authority is anchored outside human preference. The world becomes a stage where meaning is constructed rather than maintained. The memory of earlier rulers lingers as nostalgia for certainty. Golden ages, ages of harmony, times when order seemed effortless. These myths comfort, but they also mislead. They frame loss as moral failure rather than environmental or structural change. By the time modern scholarship encounters these traditions, the metaphor is hardened. Gods are assumed to be symbolic. Long reigns are dismissed as numerology. Dissent is spiritualized. Yet the discomfort remains. The feeling that something in the record does not quite belong to metaphor. That something may be the residue of a time when authority was not a story but a condition. When rulers did not need to persuade because the world itself aligned. If that is so, then the transformation of rulers into gods marks not enlightenment, but adaptation to absence. And the lingering unease suggests that this adaptation is incomplete. Because metaphors can be questioned, symbols can be reinterpreted. But the world that once held itself together without explanation remains just out of reach. Remembered not clearly enough to return to, but too vividly to forget. The question that follows is not whether gods were once kings, but what happens when kings must pretend to be gods in a world that no longer supports either. There was a moment when the questions were still allowed. Not encouraged, not rewarded, but tolerated. A brief window in which scholars, antiquarians, and early scientists approached ancient records without fully formed boundaries. They noticed the anomalies. They remarked on the long rains. They compared flood myths across continents and felt the unease settle in. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, before disciplines hardened into silos, some researchers allowed themselves to linger with the discomfort. They did not announce conclusions, they simply observed that the past appeared deeper than expected and less orderly than the prevailing timeline suggested. They noticed that king lists began too early. That civilization seemed to arrive already aged. That monumental architecture appeared without adequate prelude. That myths from distant cultures echoed one another too closely to be coincidence, yet too differently to imply simple diffusion. These observations were not fringe. They appeared in footnotes, correspondence, and early comparative works. But they were rarely foregrounded. To dwell on them required stepping outside emerging academic norms. As archaeology professionalized, it demanded restraint. As history aligned itself with national narratives, it demanded coherence. As theology consolidated, it demanded reverence. The space for unresolved questions narrowed. What had once been curiosity became liability. Scholars learned which questions led to grants, which led to silence. Investigations into symbolic meaning flourished. Speculation about literal pre-human governance did not. This filtering was not imposed by a single authority. It emerged from consensus. From the collective sense that some questions, while interesting, were unproductive. That they destabilized more than they clarified. The idea that non-human rulers might have governed the earth for thousands of years sat uneasily with the story of human progress. It suggested inheritance rather than invention, adaptation rather than ascent. Such ideas were not refuted so much as ignored. In academic literature, anomalies were reframed. Long rains became metaphor, floods became allegory. Descents became spiritual initiation. The explanatory machinery grew more elaborate as the original questions faded. This process gave rise to a peculiar asymmetry. The further back scholars looked, The more symbolic the past became, precision increased moving forward in time, while meaning dissolved moving backward. Deep history became shallow, not because evidence was lacking, but because frameworks could not accommodate it. The few who continued to press these questions often did so cautiously. They avoided definitive claims. They emphasized uncertainty. They framed their work as speculative, even when grounded in data. Yet even speculation carries risk when it challenges foundational assumptions. As the 20th century progressed, disciplines became more confident and more constrained. Archaeology emphasized material culture. Anthropology focused on social function. History prioritized documentation. Questions about non-human agency fell between fields. The irony is that modern science now acknowledges non-human intelligence in many forms. Animal cognition is complex. Artificial intelligence is advancing rapidly. The idea that intelligence could operate under conditions different from human biology is no longer absurd. Yet applying this openness retroactively to ancient history remains difficult, perhaps because doing so would require revisiting assumptions about origin, about ownership, about what it means to rule. If humanity did not invent governance, but inherited it from a previous order, then modern political and philosophical narratives become provisional. Authority loses its presumed inevitability. This discomfort may explain why early comparative insights were quietly sidelined. It is easier to believe that ancient people imagined gods than to consider that they remembered something they could no longer explain. The few records that resist this softening remain unsettling. King lists that insist on duration. Myths that refuse moral resolution. Transitions that occur without explanation. These are not the features of stories designed to instruct. They are the features of records that survived without adaptation. In some cases, the resistance to these questions took on a moral tone. To entertain the idea of non-human rulers was framed as diminishing human achievement, as denying agency, as undermining dignity. But dignity does not require originality. It can also arise from responsibility. To inherit a world is not to be lesser, it is to be accountable. This reframing, however, demands humility. It requires accepting that humanity may not occupy the center of every narrative, that intelligence, order, and authority may precede us. Such humility is difficult for institutions built on continuity and legitimacy. The result is a quiet forgetting, not enforced, but encouraged. Students are taught what is known, not what remains unresolved. Anomalies are treated as curiosities rather than signals. Over time, the questions themselves begin to feel strange, out of place, unprofessional, yet they persist, resurfacing at the margins, in interdisciplinary work, in comparative myth, in the uneasy feeling that something does not quite add up. The memory of early scholars who noticed these patterns remains faint. Their work is cited for other contributions. Their more troubling observations are footnoted away. But the questions do not disappear. They wait. They wait for frameworks flexible enough to hold them, for disciplines willing to overlap, for cultures less invested in linear narratives. Perhaps the reluctance to engage with these ideas says less about their validity and more about their implications. Because to seriously consider that non-human rulers once governed the earth is to accept that history may not be a story of ascent, but of succession, that humanity's role may be transitional rather than terminal. And that realization does not lend itself easily to pride. The scholars who first brushed against this possibility may have sensed this. They may have understood that some questions once asked cannot be contained. So the questions were allowed to fade. But fading is not disappearance. They remain embedded in the records, in the long rains, in the abrupt transitions, in the silence after the flood, waiting for a time when curiosity becomes strong enough to tolerate what certainty cannot, waiting for a listener willing to stay with the discomfort long enough to hear what it suggests. because history does not always hide its secrets. Sometimes it leaves them in plain sight, protected not by walls, but by doubt. What humanity built afterward does not look like invention, it looks like rehearsal. Across early civilizations, the structures that endure longest are not experimental. They are precise, conservative, almost hesitant. Stone laid upon stone with obsessive care, angles repeated, proportions preserved, as though the builders were copying something they did not design, afraid to deviate. This impulse appears early and persists stubbornly. Temples align with stars whose significance is no longer fully understood. Measurements repeat across continents with variations too small to dismiss as coincidence, yet too imprecise to confirm deliberate coordination. Knowledge travels without explanation, like a melody remembered without lyrics. Kingship follows the same pattern. The human ruler does not declare himself originator. He presents himself as caretaker. He maintains law rather than creating it. He invokes an earlier order to justify his authority, not his own brilliance. This is not the posture of a species discovering power for the first time. It is the posture of one trying not to break what it has inherited. Ritual becomes central because ritual preserves form without requiring understanding. A gesture repeated often enough feels correct, even when its original purpose has faded. Ceremony stabilizes societies navigating uncertainty. In this context, human kingship resembles mimicry. Thrones echo older seats of power. Crowns imitate shapes whose meaning has been forgotten. Titles persist even when their original function no longer applies. The persistence of these forms suggests reverence, but also anxiety. To change too much is to risk collapse. To innovate too freely is to admit ignorance. Human rulers rule cautiously at first. They frame themselves as bridges between worlds, mediators rather than masters. Only later, as memory fades further, does confidence grow. Power becomes assertive. Expansion replaces maintenance. Architecture reflects this shift. Early monuments emphasize durability over scale. Later empires favor size, spectacle, dominance. Precision yields to grandeur. This evolution hints at a deeper loss. The original templates may have been optimized for conditions no longer present. Replication without context leads to distortion. Consider the persistence of sacred geometry. Shapes recur long after their environmental or functional relevance disappears. They are preserved because they once worked, not because they are understood. The same is true of law. Early legal codes emphasize balance rather than punishment. Justice is corrective, not retributive. Over time, enforcement becomes harsher as coherence declines. Human societies grow louder as stability diminishes. This pattern is not accidental. When systems lose their original stabilizers, they compensate with force. Complexity increases, but resilience does not. If non-human rulers once governed through coherence rather than coercion, their absence would require humanity to approximate order through structure. Laws multiply. Institutions expand. Surveillance replaces presence. The imitation is earnest but incomplete. The most revealing aspect of this imitation is its conservatism. Early humans rarely ask whether the inherited forms are optimal. They ask only how to preserve them. Innovation is framed as restoration. Golden Age myths reinforce this mindset. The past is imagined as perfect, not because it was morally superior, but because it worked. The present feels like decline because it requires effort. This sense of decline fuels reverence, but also rigidity. Systems become sacred because they are fragile. Over generations, the distinction between original function and inherited form dissolves. People forget that what they are preserving is an approximation. The copy becomes the reference. At this stage, authority hardens. Kings no longer claim stewardship. They claim destiny. They no longer maintain balance. They impose order. Violence increases accordingly. Yet even in these later phases, echoes of the earlier model remain. Rulers still invoke alignment with heaven. They still seek signs, omens, confirmation from forces beyond themselves. The desire to reconnect never fully disappears. This persistence suggests that humanity sensed the incompleteness of its inheritance, that something essential was missing, even if it could not be named. Modern interpretations often frame early human achievement as sudden brilliance, a cognitive leap, a spark of genius. But this narrative struggles to explain why so much early sophistication appears without clear precedent. It also struggles to explain why certain technologies emerge fully formed and then stagnate or regress, why precision appears early and becomes difficult to replicate. Inheritance offers a quieter explanation. Not genius, but memory. Not invention, but continuation under constraint. If non-human rulers once governed, humanity's early role may have been auxiliary rather than central, apprentices rather than architects. When the masters withdrew, the apprentices took over with incomplete instruction. This would explain the reverence for ancestors who are not merely earlier, but different. Why the past feels heavier than the present. Why authority once felt unquestionable. It would also explain why human systems require constant reinforcement. Why institutions decay without maintenance. Why order feels artificial. The imitation continues because it must. Humanity cannot return to the original conditions. It can only repeat the forms. This repetition is not futile. It allows survival. It allows culture. It allows meaning. But it also locks humanity into patterns it does not fully understand, and so civilization advances sideways rather than forward, accumulating complexity without recovering coherence. The unsettling possibility is that humanity has never ruled in the way it imagines, that it has always been managing remnants. If that is so, then progress is not ascent but endurance. And endurance, while admirable, carries its own risks, because what is preserved without understanding cannot adapt indefinitely. Eventually the distance between imitation and origin becomes too great, and when that happens, the structures inherited from another age may no longer hold. The question that lingers quietly beneath human achievement is whether imitation can last forever, or whether remembering what was lost is the only path to something more stable. Not a return to the past, but an understanding of why it once worked, and whether humanity is willing to face what that understanding might reveal about its own place in the long succession of rulers. There is a cost to remembering too much, and an equal cost to remembering too little. Civilizations often speak of forbidden knowledge as though it were a moral failing, curiosity punished, secrets withheld to protect innocence. But the deeper pattern suggests something more pragmatic. Certain kinds of knowledge destabilize systems not because they are false, but because they are incomplete when removed from their original context. If humanity inherited governance without the conditions that made it coherent, then remembering that inheritance too clearly would be dangerous. It would reveal the gap between form and function. It would expose how much of civilization rests on approximation. This may be why ancient cultures surround origins with taboo, not to conceal truth, but to prevent misuse. Knowledge that cannot be acted upon safely becomes a liability. In many traditions, those who learn too much too quickly suffer, not because knowledge is evil, but because it exceeds the capacity of the environment to absorb it. The warning is not against understanding, but against premature application. When stories describe punishment for transgression, they often follow a similar structure. Someone crosses a boundary. Someone attempts to access what once belonged to another order. The result is imbalance. This framing makes sense if earlier rulers operated under conditions humanity could no longer sustain. To imitate their authority without those conditions would be catastrophic. Memory, then, must be regulated. This regulation does not require censorship. It requires myth. Myth slows understanding. It encodes truth in a way that resists immediate translation. It allows fragments to survive without enabling replication. The result is a civilization that remembers enough to feel loss, but not enough to recreate what was lost. This tension appears repeatedly in ancient texts. Knowledge is said to have been given, then withdrawn. Tools are described, then hidden. Names are spoken, then forbidden. The pattern suggests not cruelty, but containment. If non-human rulers once governed through coherence rather than force, then their withdrawal would leave behind systems that humans could operate only superficially. Full understanding would require conditions that no longer exist. In such a scenario, partial remembrance becomes the safest option. Modern societies often assume that more information is always better, but ancient cultures were keenly aware of thresholds. They recognized that systems can be destabilized by knowledge they cannot integrate. This awareness may explain why certain lines of inquiry disappeared, why questions about deep time and pre-human authority were allowed briefly, then quietly discouraged, why curiosity was redirected toward manageable domains. The cost of remembering too much is not confusion, it is hubris. The belief that what was once possible remains so under different conditions. The cost of remembering too little, however, is repetition. Mistakes recur because their structural causes are forgotten. Collapse feels sudden because its warning signs were mythologized away. Human history appears to oscillate between these two failures. At times, civilizations press too hard against boundaries they do not understand. At other times, they retreat into ritual and tradition, preserving forms long after their function has faded. Neither extreme restores coherence. The memory of earlier rulers sits uneasily between these poles. To forget them entirely is to deny inheritance. To remember them too literally is to invite imitation without context. So memory lingers as atmosphere rather than instruction. This may be why ancient texts speak in riddles when approaching origins. They gesture rather than explain. They preserve orientation without providing tools. The listener is meant to feel the depth of loss, not reconstruct its cause. This approach frustrates modern analysis, which seeks clarity and causality. But it may reflect an ancient understanding of limits. Some truths cannot be operationalized without harm. The disappearance of non-human rulers, then, may not have been followed by ignorance, but by restraint. A collective decision, conscious or not, to preserve stability over understanding. This restraint becomes institutionalized. Curiosity is redirected. Questions are allowed only within safe bounds. Over time, the bounds feel natural. What remains are traces that resist full assimilation. The long reigns, the abrupt transitions, the sense that history began midstream. These traces provoke unease because they hint at responsibility without instruction. They suggest that humanity is managing systems it did not design, under conditions it did not choose. To acknowledge this fully would require humility not just intellectually, but politically and philosophically. It would mean accepting that authority is conditional, that progress is fragile, that collapse is not anomaly but phase. Such acceptance threatens narratives of mastery, and so the memory remains partial. The danger is not that humanity will forget entirely, but that it will remember selectively, retaining the ambition without the caution, the form without the function. In that case, the next collapse will feel unprecedented, even though it has happened before. The ancient warnings encoded in myth and silence may not be about punishment, but about mismatch, about attempting to operate systems beyond their viable range. If earlier rulers were non-human in the sense of being adapted to a different world, then humanity's challenge is not to replace them, but to understand the limits imposed by their absence. That understanding cannot be rushed, it cannot be forced, it must emerge slowly as conditions allow. Until then, memory must remain fragmentary. The unsettling possibility is that humanity is approaching another threshold, one where remembering too little is no longer sustainable, but remembering too much too quickly could be catastrophic. The balance between these extremes has always been delicate, and the question that lingers unresolved is whether the ancient restraint was wisdom or merely delay, whether the cost of not knowing has finally exceeded the cost of knowing, and whether, when that balance tips, humanity will recognize the signs or repeat the cycle, once more mistaking inheritance for mastery. The resistance is quiet, but it is everywhere. In the modern world, the idea that history might not belong entirely to humans encounters friction at every level, not because it is outrageous, but because it destabilizes assumptions so deeply embedded they rarely announce themselves. The resistance does not arrive as censorship, it arrives as discomfort, as an instinct to redirect, as a preference for explanations that preserve continuity. Deep time unsettles modern systems of meaning. It stretches responsibility beyond lifetimes. It challenges ownership. It asks whether authority is earned or inherited under constraint. When ancient records suggest that rulers once endured for thousands of years, the modern response is swift and reflexive. Metaphor is invoked. Error is assumed. Context is declared lost. The possibility that the record preserves a literal residue is considered unnecessary. This reaction is not unscientific. It is protective. Modern institutions, political, economic, intellectual, depend on narratives of human centrality. Progress assumes authorship. Governance assumes legitimacy. If authority is inherited from a prior order, then current systems rest on stewardship rather than sovereignty. Stewardship implies limits. This implication is difficult to reconcile with ideologies built on expansion and control. It suggests that not everything can be optimized, that some systems were never designed for indefinite growth. In such a context, the idea of non-human rulers is not merely historical speculation, it is a philosophical disruption. It reframes human achievement as adaptation rather than ascent. It reframes intelligence as contextual rather than universal. It reframes collapse as structural rather than moral. These reframings resist easy integration. Modern science is often invoked as the final arbiter against such ideas, yet science itself has dismantled many assumptions about uniqueness. Human intelligence is no longer isolated. Consciousness is not singular. Time is not uniform. Stability is temporary. And yet, when these insights approach history, caution intensifies. Perhaps because history touches legitimacy. It informs identity. It shapes entitlement. If humanity is not the first to govern, then what follows humanity becomes imaginable. Succession replaces culmination. This possibility unsettles not only belief systems but policy. It raises questions about permanence, about responsibility beyond immediate benefit. The resistance thus manifests as compartmentalization. Scientific insights remain confined to laboratories. Historical narratives remain human-centered. Cross-disciplinary synthesis is discouraged by default. This separation maintains comfort. Yet the cracks widen. Climate instability mirrors ancient descriptions of imbalance. Rapid technological acceleration outpaces ethical frameworks. Systems grow complex faster than they can be stabilized. In this environment, the ancient memory of a prior order maintained by non-human rulers begins to feel less absurd and more cautionary. Not as a claim of external control, but as a reminder that coherence is not guaranteed. Modern governance relies heavily on enforcement. Surveillance expands. Regulation multiplies. These are not signs of strength, but of fragility. The earlier descriptions of authority, quiet, stabilizing, resonant, stand in contrast. The question arises softly: what kind of world requires constant correction, and what kind of world does not? The resistance to ancient anomalies may stem from an unspoken fear that current systems resemble late phases rather than beginnings, that complexity has peaked before coherence has been achieved. To admit that previous rulers operated under conditions no longer present is to admit that progress is not linear. that there are thresholds beyond which certain forms of governance cannot persist. This admission would require humility at a scale rarely practiced. It would also require redefining success, not as domination, but as alignment, not as growth, but as sustainability. The modern world struggles with such definitions, and so the anomalies remain anomalies. The long reigns remain metaphors, the transitions remain unexplained. Yet the persistence of these fragments suggests that resistance cannot erase them entirely. They resurface in moments of crisis, in the sense that something fundamental has been misaligned, in the intuition that technological power has outpaced wisdom. These intuitions are not new. They echo ancient laments. The difference is that the stakes are now planetary. If humanity inherited governance without understanding its original constraints, then modern crises may not be failures of intelligence, but of context, attempts to operate systems beyond their viable range. The resistance to this idea persists because accepting it would require redefining agency. Humanity would no longer be the sole author of history, but one chapter in a longer sequence. This reframing does not diminish human responsibility, it intensifies it. To inherit without understanding is dangerous. To govern without context is fragile. To expand without alignment is unsustainable. The ancient memory of non-human rulers thus becomes less about identity and more about warning. Not a claim of superiority, but a record of conditions under which stability once existed. Whether those conditions were environmental, cognitive, or temporal remains unclear. What is clear is that they are no longer present. The question modern systems avoid is whether they can be approximated, or whether a different form of coherence must be found. The resistance to this question is understandable. It threatens comfort. It complicates planning. It undermines certainty. But resistance does not prevent consequence. If history is succession rather than ascent, then every phase carries both inheritance and obligation. The obligation now may be to recognize limits before they are enforced by collapse, to listen to the quiet anomalies rather than smoothing them away, to accept that governance is not a human invention, but a condition that must be met, and to ask, without haste, without defensiveness, whether humanity is still operating within the range that allows stability, or whether the signs of resistance, both ancient and modern, are pointing toward another transition already in motion, a transition that, once again, may not announce itself until after it has passed. What remains, after all the fragments have been examined, is not an answer, but a weight. The idea that non-human kings once ruled the earth does not demand belief. It demands consideration. It sits quietly at the edge of history, not as a revelation, but as an unresolved inheritance. Something passed down without instruction, something present in absence. If the earliest rulers were not human in the sense that matters most, not in form, but in their relationship to time, environment, and coherence, then humanity's story begins not with creation, but with continuation. Civilization does not rise from nothing, it persists after something else withdraws. This reframing alters the meaning of progress. Advancement becomes a response to loss. Innovation becomes a strategy for coping. Complexity grows not because it is desired, but because stability no longer comes freely. In this view, humanity's achievements are neither diminished nor exalted. They are contextualized. We are not authors of the first chapter, nor merely characters in the last. We are caretakers in the middle, managing systems we did not design, under conditions we didn't choose. The ancient records, with their long reigns and abrupt transitions, do not accuse, they do not instruct, they simply remain, persistent, inconvenient, resistant to closure. They suggest that authority once functioned differently, that governance may have been less about control and more about alignment, less about enforcement and more about coherence. If that is so, then the disappearance of those rulers was not a moral failure or a conquest, it was a change in conditions, a shift that rendered a particular mode of being unsustainable. Humanity did not replace them because it was superior. It replaced them because it was adaptable. Adaptability, however, carries its own cost. It trades stability for resilience. It favours short-term survival over long-term coherence. It allows systems to persist even as their foundations erode. The inherited forms, crowns, laws, rituals, hierarchies continue because they work well enough. But working well enough is not the same as working well. Over time, the distance between form and function grows. Institutions harden. Complexity increases. Maintenance consumes more energy than creation. This pattern is visible across history. Empires expand, stabilize, fragment. Knowledge accumulates, then specializes, then disconnects. Each cycle feels unprecedented, yet echoes earlier ones. The ancient memory of rulers who endured beyond generations offers a contrast. Not a standard to be reclaimed, but a reference point. A reminder that different modes of stability once existed. Whether those modes depended on environmental conditions, cognitive integration, or temporal alignment remains unclear. Perhaps they depended on all three. What is clear is that they are no longer accessible in the same way. The danger, then, is not that humanity will forget these memories entirely. It is that it will misinterpret them, that it will seek to recreate authority without restoring coherence, that it will pursue permanence without alignment. Such attempts tend to fail violently. The wiser response may be restraint, not silence but patience, an acknowledgement that some forms of stability cannot be forced into existence under incompatible conditions. The ancient texts do not urge return. They do not promise restoration. They simply mark a difference. And in doing so, they quietly challenge the assumption that history moves toward culmination. Perhaps history moves through suitability, through phases of alignment and misalignment, through periods when certain forms of governance are possible and others are not. If that is the case, then the question facing humanity is not whether it can reclaim the authority of earlier rulers, but whether it can recognize the limits of its own. Recognition is not defeat, it is orientation. To understand that governance is conditional is to understand that collapse is not punishment, but signal. A message that conditions have shifted beyond viability. The ancient memory of non-human kings does not predict the future. It contextualizes the present. It suggests that stability is rare, fragile, and dependent on factors often ignored until they fail. It suggests that succession is not a linear ascent, but a series of adaptations to absence. And it suggests that humanity's role, however long it lasts, is provisional. This realization need not be frightening. Provisional does not mean meaningless. It means accountable. To inherit without understanding is dangerous. To understand without humility is worse. The quiet power of these ancient records lies in their refusal to conclude. They do not resolve into doctrine. They do not collapse into myth. They remain slightly misaligned with every framework imposed upon them. They ask only that the listener stay with the discomfort, that the long rains not be dismissed too quickly, that the silence after the flood not be smoothed away, that the possibility of earlier rulers be held without urgency to explain. In that stillness, something emerges, not certainty, but perspective. The sense that humanity is not alone in time, even if it is alone now. The sense that civilization is not an achievement to be celebrated, but a condition to be maintained carefully. The sense that what has been lost may not be recoverable, but its absence can still teach. As the night deepens and the world grows quieter, these thoughts do not demand action. They invite reflection. They settle gently like sediment, shaping understanding slowly. And perhaps that is how such memories were meant to survive. Not as commands, not as answers, but as weight. A reminder that the ground beneath history is deeper than it appears, and that whatever ruled before humanity, its most enduring legacy may not be power at all, but the question of how to live responsibly in its absence.